Hey, all right, week 2. So, last week I talked about this sort of interim period in Russian literary history, right, between the revolution and Stalin coming to power. And it's a relatively free time. This is not to say that the Bolsheviks were not repressive in their way. They were extremely repressive against religion. You could, in fact, go too far in the things that you said and did to criticize them. But also, as we saw with Zoshchenko and with Babel, there was a great deal of freedom to really critique what was going on in society. And I think something worth noting in both of their cases is that they are critiquing that society from the standpoint of people who want it to get better, right? They're both committed Bolsheviks. They believe in the revolution. They believe in the ideology of Marxism-Leninism. And they're sort of concerned about keeping it on the right track. And so Zoshchenko is criticizing the creeping Meshchantseva of the home front, and Babel is critiquing, frankly, the violence and disarray that's going on within the Red Army during the war. And they can do so, right? So there's this kind of interim under Lenin. Eventually, Stalin comes to power, and there is no more freedom anymore. So the history of Stalin's dictatorship over Russia is a tremendously violent one. And one of the readings for this week is Varlam Shalamov, and he's writing from one of the gulags from a prison camp. So we see that. I want to talk about Platonov first. There's a way in which it's much more complex, even though the story itself is written in very simple language and seems relatively straightforward. Starting in 1934, this announcement is made at the Union of Writers Congress. Stalin announces as the official aesthetic of the Soviet Union, Soviet socialist realism. It is the only style in which any art is allowed to be produced in the Soviet Union going forward. And socialist realism has particular requirements. It has to be realistic. And realistic in the sense we've been using the term in terms of representation, right? So in visual art, the thing looks like what it looks like, right? In literature, this very, Tolstoyan, very straightforward description, if we're in a field, we're in a field, right? It's supposed to be typical, meaning that it's supposed to represent typical Soviet life. It's supposed to be proletarian, and by proletarian, we actually mean it's supposed to be very accessible. And the straightforward way to say this is that the stupidest person in the room has to be able to understand it. Because, of course, it's doing propagandistic work. And it has to be partisan. You have to explicitly support, at a minimum, the principles of Marxism-Leninism, though, as I already mentioned before, those shift a great deal over time, what exactly we mean when we say Marxism-Leninism, so good luck. But ideally, it directly supports the party and directly supports Stalin. So you're writing, therefore, you're producing all kinds of art under these tremendous restrictions. And it's not just that you won't get published, it's that if you violate these things, Babel is taken outside, shot, and his corpse is burnt, right? This happens. Zoshchenko also eventually dies in a prison. So, right. Platonov starts out his career actually as an engineer. And so he, in a sense, has a kind of scientific background that he is working from as a writer. He, for many years, can't get published. He's thrown out of the Union for a while. His son is sent to the Gulag. Most people think just as a way of threatening him. The son gets tuberculosis there and dies. So he suffers in his own way under Stalin, but he continues to try to write and get published. And what's interesting is that he sometimes manages to do it. So when we're thinking about the return, one thing that you need to think about is these restrictions that he was under, that he had to follow the tenets of socialist realism, that it had to meet those requirements, realistic, typical, proletarian, and partisan. this gets published, but Stalin hated it. And Stalin, I mean, this is who this dude was. He killed millions and millions of people, and he's directly involved in it. He would sit down with stories and a red pen, literally, and, you know, return this to the censors, like, this is what they got wrong, this is what they should have edited, this guy, you know, he took a personal interest in tormenting and killing people. So there's actually records, Soviets love bureaucracy. So there's records of Stalin's notes on this story from Platonov, and Stalin hated it. And so something to think about is the fact that, and I think this is interesting, that Platonov manages to get this published. It gets through the censors, it gets through, you know, it meets the requirements, and yet Stalin consents. He knows, he's not stupid. Stalin knows that it's not about anything it's supposed to be about. And so one thing to think about is what this story actually is about. The tension between the fact that he manages to meet the requirements, he gets it published, and Stalin hates it, and it's not what Stalin wants at all, right? It displeases the dictator at the same time that it technically meets the standards. Another thing that's interesting to think about in this story is the fact that a form, since we're talking about formalism, a form emerges in Soviet socialist writing that the brave Western Slavic scholar Katerina Clark documented in the 80s. And I say brave because she arrives at this in the way that, in a dreadfully boring way. So she sits down with all of these Soviet novels, and as you can imagine, writing under the strictures of Soviet socialist realism, most of this stuff is dreadful. It's not that the writers are bad writers, it's that under these restrictions, it's very hard to make good art, right? And so she sits down with all of these dreadful books that are, you know, they're called production novels, and it will literally be things like, oh no, will we get the still mill up and running in time? Right? These very sort of dreadful things. She sits down with all of them, and she reads them all, thinking particularly about structure, and she realizes they all follow the same pattern. And this is not deliberate, this is not mandated. There's just a large crash in the background of my house, and I'm willing to bet that it was a cat. But I think it was upstairs. I don't know. Let's just keep going. Anyway. So anyway, I totally lost my train of thought. So, this is not part of the requirement, this form that Clark discovers, but nevertheless it emerges. So one interesting question is just the fact that what about these requirements generates this form, right? And I mean, this is just sort of a question to mull upon. But the form is as follows. There is a hero, and he is a good guy, but he is not yet a conscious guy. And by conscious, we mean ideologically conscious, right? He's a good person, but he's not necessarily a good communist yet. And he has a mentor who is a good communist. And he has a task that he needs to complete. Get the still mill up and running, fight the Nazis, whatever it is. And there are challenges, right? There are problems that arise throughout the book that sort of make up the middle of the book where it looks like, you know, one thing after another, the task is not going to be completed. And we reach the climax of the story. And upon this climax, it just seems like, nope, the hero's not going to be able to get it done. He goes to the mentor gives him just what he needs at that moment. It might be a piece of information, it might be encouragement, it might be an actual physical object, whatever it is. And at this moment, the problems are resolved. He awakens to consciousness, he becomes a good communist besides just being a good person. The task is completed, everything is resolved happily, right, in favor of the motherland. And this form, Clark realizes just over and over again. And I think one thing that we can think about is that that form emerges in this short story too. And so we can think about, you know, who's the hero, who's the mentor, what's the task, what are the challenges, what's the climax, what is this last minute intervention by the mentor, what's the happy ending, right? We can go through that with this story too. And again, this idea that it is conforming both intentionally and unintentionally to the forms of Soviet socialist literature. And yet, again, there's this overarching question of theme. What is the theme of this story? Because it's something that Stalin hated. So actually this is, although the language is simple, because it has to be, proletarian, dumbest guy in the room, right? there's something actually very complex happening here, and I think that's worth thinking about. And Platonov is actually a great writer, even though he had to write the way he had to write. The other side of this is Varlam Shalamov. He's writing from the Gulag, by which I mean after he is released, he spends 19 years in the Gulag, most of them in Kolyma, which is one of the most brutal camps in the entire system. It is unbelievable that he didn't die there. The Gulags are prison camps. They are not directly analogous to, say, Holocaust concentration camps, insofar as you could theoretically go there, work out your sentence, live and get out and go home, and it's true, and people did, and so the idea wasn't necessarily death. The idea was actually terror. That's the primary idea, that Stalin used these camps as a way to inspire terror in people, knowing that themselves, their relatives, whoever, right, could be sent there at any time. And then secondarily, they were also used for labor, right? These people mined, they built infrastructure projects, they, it's slave labor is what it is. And so it had that practical function as well, although a great deal of study has been done on the fact that it's not actually, because of various bureaucracy and corruption and theft, and they were no more efficient than just government employees at getting anything done, and certainly no more cost effective. But I said their primary goal was terror, to terrorize the population, and Stalin did it for 25 years. And so Shalamov is sent to the camps. And when he emerges, he writes about his experiences there. Now, this comes out of a collection called Kolyma Tales. I would say they are true stories, but they are not necessarily completely accurate, by which I mean he admits to this, he combines, one event from one point in time and place and one event from another point in time and place, etc., etc. He wants to get to the truth of his experience, but he's not necessarily concerned with writing a strictly factual, historical account. He also, it's written for the drawer. And this is a phrase in Russian history. The idea that, Shalamov gets out and he dies before the collapse of the Soviet Union. This is not published in his lifetime. He dies a poor old man. He's physically a wreck, obviously, after he comes out of these camps. You can see by the description of how they live. And he writes for his own sake. And he puts it away in the hopes that maybe someday people will be free and his work will get published. And many, many people during this time in the Soviet Union did the same thing. I said it's called writing for the drawer, and he did. And eventually he got published, and this is now one of the most famous books of Soviet history. So, one thing that I think can help us understand a day off, I suggested looking at the structure because we have this tremendous bifurcation, right? This mysterious, beautiful, miraculous, shimmering, shining white mass in the forest. And then we move into this dark, dank pit with these criminal prisoners. And then, of course, the two things sort of collide at the end of the story. And everything is just a contrast. Those little squirrels watching the mass versus what happens with the puppy. Even the animal experience, everything is there mirrored in this dark way. And I think something that can help us to understand what's happening here is the idea of the difference between the criminal prisoner and the political prisoner. In the camps, there were people who were sent there for committing crimes. Certainly violent crimes like murder and rape, but also theft. And honestly, anything. And I think it's important to understand that in actual history, there were so many people, particularly after World War II, because remember, millions and millions and millions of people in Russia died during World War II. The Red Army saved the world. Stalin aside, the Red Army saved the world from Hitler. Millions of soldiers died. Millions of civilians died, absorbing the trauma, the shock of that invasion. And in fact, the aftermath of that is what Platonov story is about, the return from World War II. It's tremendous what the Russian people did and the Soviet army did for the world in defeating Hitler. But after this, you have famine, chaos, tons of orphanings. And there is just a direct pipeline from, the Soviet orphanage to the Soviet gulag. Kids that have completely inadequate parenting, no parenting, basically nothing from the state. It's a completely inadequate facility. They're out for like a month or two. Inevitably, they fall into some kind of petty crime, and boom, you're in the gulag, and that's your life story. So it's incredibly unfair to say that criminal prisoners are, in some sense, necessarily bad versus political prisoners, whom, of course, have done nothing wrong, basically, right? I mean, under Article 58 of the Soviet Penal Code, you could be put into the gulag for any minor ideological crime. So in that sense, the political prisoners certainly are innocent themselves. But I said, it is not fair to say that the criminal prisoners are, on the other hand, just bad. I mean, murder is bad, right? But I'm saying, in a general sense, there's many people there who... But amongst the political prisoners, and remember, they are almost exclusively the ones who get to write books about this. Amongst the political prisoners, the criminal prisoners are considered to be scum. Just a vile taint. And man, we see it. Man, Shalamov goes, and it's not just Shalamov. There's many, many famous narratives that come out of the gulag. They're almost all by political prisoners, and everyone that is by the political prisoners holds the criminal prisoners up as just subhuman, vile, disgusting. And one way to understand this is the sense that if you are an innocent person and you are put into prison, the sense not just of it being unfair, but of you being corrupted, right? That you are put into this filthy, disgusting, vile place with some people who are criminals, actual criminals, and they are given more privileges than political prisoners. The common criminal prisoners are considered by the Soviet government to actually be less of a threat than this fifth column, supposedly, of wreckers in the Russian population that form the political prisoners. And so criminal prisoners, they get more food, they get better work duties. In many places, they're put in charge of political prisoners because there aren't actually that many guards in these places. They exist, they're secure, quote unquote, because they're so far away in the wilderness that you couldn't escape because there's nowhere to go. So there's actually not that many guards. There's criminal prisoners that, have these guard duties, dealt out to them, etc., etc. Obviously, this causes resentment. But there's also this psychological phenomenon where the literature records that political prisoners seem desperate in their writings to separate themselves from the corruption of the criminal prisoner. And we can see this with Shalamov, right? I mean, that poor little, he licks their human hand, and then they just kill him. Now, let us think for a second about starving, literally starving, because the rations were not enough to keep you alive. Starving to death in a prison camp. I think I'd eat a puppy. I bet you would too. But Shalamov doesn't cast it that way, right? And then at the end, the trick they play on the priest is just a cruel joke. And I think there's something tremendously interesting when we think about this idea of contamination, about taint, right? The idea that these political prisoners go into this place innocent and are subjected, this anxiety, right? They're subjected to this contamination from this criminal element that in their minds they've constructed to be just wholly vile and wholly terrible. And, the priest, his body physically rejects it. He can barely get out the door before he throws up after he discovers what it is. But he confesses that it tastes good. That anxiety of the contaminate, he's a little contaminated, right? Not just merely by the physical food, but also it tasted good, right? And so there's a great deal of anxiety that's being expressed here, right? The not just over the camp conditions, right? That's something we can, think about, and it's fine to say that this is also obviously an indictment of slave labor camps, and fair enough. But also this sort of psychological position that the political prisoner is put in, and of course the priest is also a political prisoner, right? He's there because of his religion. The position that the political prisoner is put in, right? Bound up in this system. And another thing too that I think is interesting is that Shalamov as narrator, the narrator here, seems incapable. I mean, he's capable of abstractly understanding that what the criminal prisoners have done is disgusting, but he can't react to it, and he knows what's coming. He doesn't stop the he doesn't intervene. There's a kind of deadness, right? And that's something that I think is interesting to think about too. So anyway, that is some background, some stuff for you to think about for writings from this era. These two authors, I said in a strange way, they sort of go together, right? They have different opportunities for expression, and but they've come through the same sort of hell under Stalin, and so, anyway, some things for you to consider as you go forward into your journals.